People who have lived in dorms, what is your craziest dorm story? So, I lived on the top floor of a 17-story dorm. It was a co-ed floor, and it was the computer science, CS floor. There were around 50 people on the floor, half guys, half girls. So, we had 25 of the nerdiest guys you could find and 25 really attractive girls who weren't even in CS. They just got stuck with this floor because it was the last one with rooms available. Anyway, it had been a few weeks of living together when one of the guys had his birthday. He was a stereotypical, skinny, nerdy CS major. A few of us girls thought it would be hilarious to get him a dancer girl, so we started calling up different places. Apparently, none of the girls wanted to come to a dorm, but we finally found one willing to come. The guy on the phone said the price would be around $250. We didn't have $250. In fact, I barely had $5 for a drink at a party later that night. So, we came up with a genius idea. We'd spread the word across all 17 floors of the dorm that we were ordering a dancer and charge $5 per person at the elevator to watch. The time finally came, and people started showing up. We crammed a bunch of chairs into the lounge. By the time the dancer girl arrived, there were around 50 people packed into our tiny lounge. The birthday guy was sitting in the middle of the room in a chair, and everyone else was circled around him. When the girl showed up, it was just as bad as we expected. She looked like she had walked straight out of a trailer park into our dorm. She had a schoolgirl outfit that probably hadn't fit her since high school, and she was pushing 30 with a few extra pounds. She was shocked when she saw 50 people waiting for her to dance. She thought it was going to be a small, intimate gathering. We had never ordered a dancer before, so we didn't have any music set up. She started by going around the room and giving everyone a dance, which was awkward, but not too weird. Then it got weird. Very weird. She finally turned her attention to the birthday guy, who had been nervously waiting in the middle of the room. She stood him up, took off his belt, and he looked like he was about to pass out. Then she took his clothes of him, completely bare, in front of all 50 people. The poor guy was bright red and frozen in place. At this point, I thought he might die of embarrassment. It didn't stop there. She then proceeded to use his belt on him and did all the typical dancer things, wrapped his pickle in money and took it off with her mouth. Meanwhile, the birthday guy was basically shrinking inside himself, and the entire room was in awkward silence, just watching this train wreck unfold. No one could look away. Finally, she finished up, and everyone bolted out of the room. The birthday guy holed up in his room for a while, but eventually, he came out of his shell again. Let's just say he's not the same after that night. Story 2. The first weekend I was on campus, I was coming back from a party when I noticed a bunch of people from my floor sitting outside my room. I was kind of confused but didn't think too much of it. So, I asked why they were all there, but all I got were half-hearted responses. Finally, I just shrugged and said something like, "Well, have a good night, I guess." Then, someone spoke up and said, "Dude, you don't want to go in there." Now, with a bit of a buzz going, I made a snarky comment like, "Whatever. You guys are all mute," and opened the door. To my surprise, I walked in on my roommate, who I'd known for all of 6 hours, going at it with a girl on his bunk. And over to the side, there were 2 other people getting busy on our sofa. So yeah, basically a bunch of strangers were just hooking up in my room. But here's the real kicker. There was one more person in the room. Another random girl, fully dressed, sitting there completely unfazed, just scrolling through Facebook while everything else was happening. She and I made eye contact for a moment, and she just looked completely done with it all. I closed the door slowly, turned around, and joined the crowd in the hallway. Story 3. On the first night of moving in at the freshman dorms, we were all required to meet in the common area at 8 p.m. to get to know everyone on our floor. The group was split between guys and girls, and after roll call, we noticed 3 people were missing, 1 girl and a pair of guys. Their room was in plain sight from where we were, so someone volunteered to knock on their door. When the door swung open, there they were, with their shirts off and wrapped in a bed sheet, walking out slowly with these huge grins on their faces. Before we could even process what was going on, a girl suddenly bolted from their room and sprinted down the hall to her own room. The rest of us were just sitting there, kind of stunned in silence, when Guy 1 casually goes, "Yeah, we hit that." And Guy 2, without missing a beat, pumps his arm and says, "Choo choo." They get dressed, come back out like nothing happened, and it was as if the whole thing had never occurred. The girl, though, was left with the unfortunate nickname Train, and soon enough, people started writing things like "choo choo" or "all aboard" on the whiteboard outside her door. It was clear everything had been consensual, and over time, she seemed to own it, but I do feel bad for her. She was pretty embarrassed to have gotten caught in front of the whole dorm floor. Story 4. One night, My roommate and I went out to a party with a guy from across the hall, let's call him Greg, and a friend of mine from high school, Maddie, who lived in a different dorm. At the end of the night, Maddie decided to come back to the dorm with us, even though we walked past her dorm, and somehow, Greg ended up coming back to our room too. I'm not sure if this was something that was planned or just happened. Everyone was really drunk, so I honestly couldn't tell you. We all got back to the dorm and, naturally, pushed both beds together to create enough space for 4 people to sleep. The problem was, my bed was on bed risers, so the 2 beds didn't make a flat surface. As a result, I ended up sleeping on my bed, while the other 3 squeezed into the other twin bed. Fast forward, my roommate, Maddie, and Greg ended up having a 3 score just inches away from my sleeping body. To make matters worse, they all ended up getting chlamydia because my roommate and Maddie had also had a 3-way with another guy at the party earlier that night. The cherry on top? Maddie had to get the morning after pill because the rubber Greg shared between her and my roommate broke. I wish I was joking. I'm not. Story 5. A couple of winters ago, I was in my room just playing video games when my neighbor knocked on my door, wearing nothing but his undies, and told me he needed help. I was a little thrown off, but I figured I'd see what was up. Turns out, he'd taken 3 hits of LSD and was having a really bad trip. His friend, who lived on the same floor, showed up, and the 2 of us decided we'd look after him to make sure he didn't do anything crazy. Of course, he did something crazy anyway. He grabbed his wallet and bolted, running full speed across campus. His friend was way too high to be of any help, and I'm chronically lazy and have asthma, so we couldn't catch up. The last I saw of him that night, he was running straight into the woods on the edge of campus. Later, my friend called the porters, and we found out that he'd ended up running onto the main road and jumped in front of an oncoming car, shattering its windshield. I honestly thought he'd either be arrested or at least end up in the hospital. The next morning, I woke up and went to get breakfast. As I left my room, I saw him coming back wearing a hospital gown, acting like nothing had happened. Then, to top it off, he accused me of stealing his wallet. Story 6. It was my first week in my new dorm, 2 weeks before school started, and my roommates and I thought it would be a great idea to throw a party to meet everyone. We went all out. We made Skittles vodka, filled our fridge, and even our neighbor's fridge, with beer, made about 200 Jell-O shots, bought 3 ounces of weed, and invited everyone in the building. To really understand how wild the story gets, you need to know that my room was on the 3rd floor, right next to the elevator, and there was a large communal balcony right in front of my door. The party was a hit. We had about 100 people packed into our little 3-bedroom dorm. Everyone was shoulder to shoulder. A few of us spent the first few hours hotboxing the bathroom with a towel stuffed in the door crack. I was way beyond anything I could have imagined. When I walked out of the bathroom, I saw a guy sitting on top of our refrigerator doing something inappropriate. Everyone just left him alone because, well, who wants to mess with a guy in that state? We kept playing beer pong and having a good time, but then we heard a knock on the door. One of the guests opened it, and guess who walked in? The police. The officers immediately started yelling at everyone to turn down the music and line up. The guy on top of the fridge, still in his state, yelled, "It's Officer Krupka." Then he jumped off the fridge, ran straight past the cops, and launched himself off the balcony. Everyone thought he was done for, including the officers, who quickly called for an ambulance. I walked to the balcony edge to see what happened. The guy landed face first, on his still exposed area, and somehow stood up, looked around, shouted, "Screw the police," pulled up his pants, and casually walked off. That night was unforgettable. Story 7. At the start of my freshman year, I met a lot of different people, trying to figure out who I could be friends with. One Thursday night, I went out partying with a group of girls, and we all got pretty hammered. Afterward, we went back to our dorm building and decided to hang out in one girl's room for more shots, which, honestly, we didn't need. We took 2 more shots, and at that point, we were all at our limits. I'm gay, and I had assumed another guy in our friend group was too. He was talking about needing to get laid. So I joked, "Just download Grindr, you'll find a guy in no time." He looked at me and said, "I'm straight." I was so embarrassed I didn't know what to say, but the girls in the room weren't having it. They started shouting, "No, you're not. Stop lying." He kept denying it, but one of the girls told him to prove it. She pulled out her shirt, showing her pierced tips, and told him to put them in his mouth. At this point, I had only known these people for about a week, and I was in complete shock. He freaked out, yelling, "What are you doing?" And then finally admitted, "Okay, I'm gay." I was honestly relieved. Everyone reassured him it was fine, but the vibe was super awkward, so we decided to take more shots. We ended up getting way too drunk, and later, the other guy and I ended up hooking up. That's the end of that story. I've got crazier college stories, but this one definitely takes the cake for wild dorm moments. Story 8. I came back to my dorm one night after finals and walked into a nightmare. My roommate, who never cleaned up or changed her sheets, was doing the deed with her boyfriend in my bed. Yeah, no way I was dealing with that. I'd already tried talking to her about her mess, so I was ready to take the next step, getting the administration involved. I walked across the hall to the RA's room, who was a senior. She told me she'd write up a report for the office as soon as she was done with what she was doing. And what was she doing? Smoking the biggest bong I'd ever seen. Seriously, this thing was almost as tall as the ceiling. For some context, these were the honors dorms. I told her I'd wait outside in the study room, but she was like, "Nah, come help me smoke this dank kush." So, I did. After a few puffs, we wrote up the report, totally high, and then stumbled to the front office with bloodshot eyes, laughing uncontrollably. When I got back to my dorm, my roommate was playing World of Warcraft on the bed, without any clothes, and her boyfriend was nowhere to be found. I asked her why she used my bed to hook up. Her response? Her sheets were dirty, so instead of getting more grossness on her own sheets, she decided to share mine. Turns out, she was already on probation for drinking SoCo in front of her old roommate, who reported her, since drinking on campus was against the rules. She ended up getting kicked out of the honors college and had to move out the next week. The best part? I didn't have a roommate at all the next semester. I got a single for the price of a double, all thanks to my stoner RA and my filthy roommate. Story 9. Oh God, I really hope my friend doesn't see this. So, one Friday night, my roommate and I were drinking in our dorm room. We were kind of being jerks, to be honest. We were at another friend's birthday dinner, but ended up buying alcohol off him to skip his party. We brought along this guy who had a huge crush on my roommate. So, we're all drinking, having a good time, and then, out of nowhere, this guy starts making out with her. I was sitting on my laptop, just browsing Reddit, so I honestly didn't care what was happening right next to me. Even when he pushed her onto my bed, I didn't mind. I was too caught up in random threads. Next thing I know, I hear her shout my name. He's playing with my melons. I just started cheering him on like, go for it. She was on the floor giggling while they kept making out, and then he started some heavy petting over her clothes. Eventually, I decided I'd had enough and fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up to find him asleep in her bed. Both of them were bare, and the entire room was covered in Nutella. A brand new jar of Nutella had been smeared everywhere. I was in complete shock. I honestly have no idea what happened that night. My roommate freaked out, kicked him out, and he walked out doing some sad George Michael thing, then came back 5 minutes later to ask if he could get some water and a piece of gum from me. I spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning up the Nutella and smashed Cocoa Puffs, which, for some reason, were smushed into my sneakers. While my roommate puked and the guy kept texting me links to sappy love songs, saying that's how he felt, and I needed to pass the message along to my roommate. Needless to say, we don't talk about that day anymore. Story 10. Here's some backstory. I knew this guy, David, in college. He was an absolute legend. He was a D1 swimmer, partied hard and got blackout drunk 3 to 4 times a week, yet still managed to ace organic chemistry while doing all of that. Now he's in med school. Guy is a freaking genius. It was like the booze made him smarter. Move-in day, junior year. David was living off campus that year, but came back to visit us. It was around 9 p.m., and he was already hammered. He kept trying to get my roommate and me to go out with him, but we were exhausted and sweaty from moving in, so we turned him down. The hallways in our dorm were breezeways, basically continuous balconies open to the courtyard, visible from our window. So, on his way out, we could hear and see David with a couple of his friends. He says, "Hold on, I'm just gonna piss off your balcony real quick," whips it out in front of a group of freshman girls heading out for the night, and proceeds to piss right into the courtyard below, all for the world to see. Welcome to college, ladies. Then there was the time my friend Joel, a fencer, came to my door at 2 a.m. on a Saturday night, shouting, "Quick, come upstairs, I'm really drunk and about to fence Scott." His roommate. At the time, David was living on the second floor in Joel and Scott's suite, and he was already upstairs, also drunk. Joel grabs practice swords, puts on his fencing mask, and they start sword fighting in the breezeway. Joel was a bit drunk, but holding his own. Scott, on the other hand, was falling down drunk and did an accidental split after lunging too hard. That's when David, shirtless and totally smashed, comes running out of their suite yelling, "Gimme the sword, gimme the sword." He grabs the sword from Scott's hand and starts flailing around like some kind of Errol Flynn. Joel managed to catch him across the chest, leaving a nice welt for David to discover in the morning. At that point, they decided to call it quits. Well, Scott and Joel went back to their room, and David, still wasted, said, "I think I'm just gonna sleep here," and laid down on the concrete floor. My friend Ryan and I had to work together to get him to stand up, so we could basically drag him back to his room. Our dorm was always full of chaos, but those were the stories that really stood out to me. Story 11. During my freshman year of college, I tried shrooms a few times while in the dorms. The first time, they hit hard around 1 a.m. I remember watching Alice in Wonderland and thinking it was the worst thing ever created. To distract myself from the chaos on screen, I started playing with my phone charger. I wrapped it around my arm, tied it, and suddenly felt this surge of power. Then, I added my laptop charger to the other arm, and the feeling intensified. I got the idea to try and steal my friends' chargers, who were also tripping, and managed to grab a couple and tie them to myself. One friend, in the middle of his own trip, started collecting shoes, and we argued over whether chargers or shoes were more valuable, trying to use them as currency. After about an hour of this madness, I got frustrated that I didn't have enough cords and decided to ask my roommate if I could borrow his. I'll never forget how confused he looked when I woke him up, covered in cords, asking for more to increase my power. He said no, so I respected that and only took the cord from our dorm phone. From there, I pretended to date the phone and talked to it for way longer than I care to admit. Moral of the story: shrooms can be pretty damn fun. I was fully aware of how ridiculous I was being, but honestly, I just didn't care. Story 12. My roommate decided college wasn't for him and stopped going to class altogether. Instead, he went out drinking every night until he blacked out, then came back to the dorm and would challenge me to random, pointless fights. One night, he punched me in the face just because I was watching TV, and he wanted to change the channel. I didn't say anything. It was my first month of college, and I was trying to prove I didn't need help. For 2 months, I basically lived like an abuse victim. Every time he came home, I'd cringe, not knowing what would set him off or why he'd want to fight me that day. In October, he called his parents and told them he was dropping out, but they refused and said he needed to finish the semester. In response, he lost it completely, smashing everything he owned. His cell phone went flying into the wall. His Guitar Hero controllers got slammed into the ground. He punched a hole in the TV and dropkicked his printer/scanner. Total meltdown. Then he realized what he'd done and started chugging laundry detergent and taking whatever pills he could find in a desperate attempt to end it all. At that point, I ran to get the RA, who called the police. He was taken away for a psych evaluation. That was the worst 18th birthday I could have imagined. On the bright side, his parents came to pick him up and he left college for good. I took one of his pillows as a screw you and sleep with it every night, pressed firmly up against my grundle. Screw you, Craig. Story 13. During my freshman year, our bathroom became a magnet for all kinds of weird, crap-related chaos. It was like the Hellmouth from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but with a lot more bodily function. This was a first-floor, gender-neutral bathroom that often had up to an inch of standing water on the floor at any given time. It was also a prime spot for passed-out drunks and their vomit. But there were 3 major characters that really elevated this bathroom to legendary status. The first was the Birdman. This guy had long hair, a beard, and dressed in a leather hat and trench coat, like a kinky cowboy or the Undertaker's more sensitive nephew. He always had a parakeet perched on his shoulder, and while he never spoke to anyone on my floor, I saw him more than once sitting in the bathroom's nasty old bathtub, taking a bath with his bird. Next, we had the Squatch Brothers, 2 giant, lumpy guys on the basketball team who wandered the halls shirtless all day, bellowing down the hall to their friends at 2 a.m., waking everyone up and generally not caring. One of their friends, whose name started with an E, lived on our floor, so naturally, they'd stand at the end of the hall and shout at all hours to wake him up. They also had a habit of clogging the sinks while shaving. Every dorm has a serial crapper. The dorm next door had someone they called the Big Big Pooper, and we had King Cologne. Every Wednesday morning, without fail, we'd return from class and be greeted by a foul stench wafting out of the bathroom. Then you'd go inside, and the smell would only get worse. This was the kind of smell that would punch you in the gut and steal your lunch. And there, in the middle stall, you'd find King Cologne's latest creation. I swear, the size and girth of these things could have rivaled a small child's leg. Even with our college's industrial strength power flush, it was like a beached whale. No matter how the tide came in, it never got flushed down. We'd have to wait for hours while it dissolved before the toilet would finally swallow it. I'm pretty sure that toilet deserved a Purple Heart after our dorm was renovated. King Cologne ruled that bathroom with an iron sphincter all year, and we just had to deal with it. Later, I found out it was one of the Squatch brothers. Nobody was surprised. Story 14. Most people's weird stories are about other people. This one's about me. So, something I discovered in my freshman year of college. I sleepwalk. It doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen, especially when I'm drunk. There's this one night that really stands out. It was during the Tour de Francia, which, yes, took place in my own dorm. The dorm was laid out kind of in a circle, so we turned it into our own version of the Tour de France, minus the steroids and actual bikes. Instead, we rode Walmart kiddie bikes, and of course, had to match the classiness with the finest boxed wine available, Franzia. As soon as I hopped on the bike, I started thinking, did Lance Armstrong lose a testicle to cancer, or just bike seats? Because, man, those things really hurt your balls. The race itself was a mess, crashing into walls and hoping our RA didn't come back too soon from doing God knows. With his Esto, who lived in the building next door and always came back at odd hours. It ended with some overly serious guy who was way too sober for this kind of nonsense. Of course, this guy was also the same one who reported me to the RA for having loud banging session. He was my neighbor and I just couldn't deal with him. So I thought, well, that was fun, and headed to bed drunk. Like any freedom-loving person, I sleep with no clothes on. There's just something about soft sheets keeping your wand warm and cozy. So, I'm all snug and fall asleep. But sleepwalking me decides it's time to go to the bathroom. I stumble up, climb over my couch, and stumble out of my room. The best place to relieve myself? The room next door. I walked in, placed my hand on the wall above the urinal, and started what can only be described as a creative writing session, swaying back and forth while Niagara Falls was going down. After that, I found some flip-flops on the floor, put them on, and went back to sleep. I woke up the next morning with my RA telling me I had 3 charges against me, and people asking if I remembered what I did last night. Spoiler, I didn't. Story 15. I was visiting a friend at another school for the first time, and we had planned to smoke. But when we walked into his dorm room, we were shocked to find a girl in labor on his bed. We just froze, speechless, until his roommate came rushing back from the bathroom with a wet towel, shouting, "Don't freak out! Don't freak out!" It turned out the girl was his roommate's sister, who lived nearby and had come to visit. She went into labor a few weeks early, so everyone was caught off guard. They eventually took an ambulance to the hospital, and once they left, we realized she had been sitting on my friend's bed when her water broke. We spent some time cleaning up the mess, then decided to smoke like never before to try and erase the image of a complete stranger screaming in pain from our minds. Story 16. My brother's frat had a pretty wild mishap one winter when they flooded the second floor of their house. They laid down plastic sheeting to try and contain the water, then opened all the windows to help with the freezing. The result was like a makeshift ice rink, and for a few days, they had a full-on indoor skating setup. But things took a turn for the worse when the weight of the water and ice caused the second floor to collapse. It fell straight through the first floor and all the way down into the basement. The whole place was a wreck, and they ended up losing their charter. It was a total disaster, but looking back, it's honestly a miracle that nobody got seriously hurt or killed. Story 17. My roommate was this awkward, 400-pound guy who spent most of his time watching Sailor Moon in the original Japanese, completely immersed in his world. He had this tiny, fiery redhead of a girlfriend who somehow managed to dominate him in every way. Physically, mentally, you name it. She'd regularly beat the crap out of him, and the strangest part was, he actually let her. One Thursday evening around 6 p.m., he suddenly asks if I can vacate the room until 11, because they were planning to have some romantic time. I was a little annoyed since he hadn't given me any heads up, but I decided to leave anyway. I came back around midnight and walked into a scene that I'll never forget. There she was, in black vinyl bondage gear, complete with a riding crop and a taxi driver's hat, riding him as he lay there completely covered in welts from head to toe. I stood there for a second, processing what I was seeing, and then I immediately noped the hell out of there. Story 18. During my freshman year of college, I was dormed on the same floor as the entire soccer team. I was told that they throw a big party every time they win a game, so I was advised to lock my door on game nights. The season started, but there were no parties, so I just assumed our team was really bad. One night, after a few drinks and some billiards with friends, I came back to my floor late in the season and heard music blasting. I figured they must have won a game. When the elevator doors opened, I was hit by the sound of music, but there was no one in the lobby, so I thought maybe they were having the party in their rooms or something. I went in my room to grab some stuff for a shower and headed to the communal unisex bathroom. When I walked in, I realized the party wasn't in the rooms, it was in the bathroom. There were probably 30 or 40 people crammed in there, most of them barely dressed. Some wore towels around their waists, and a few girls were just straight up bare, sipping from solo cups. They had huge speakers set up on the sink counter, and people were hooking up in the stalls. Since I was already tipsy from hanging out with my friends, I decided to just go ahead and take my shower during the party. I made my way through the crowd and into an empty shower stall, trying to wash up as quickly as I could. Before I was done, a cute girl in just a towel, with one jug exposed, opened the curtain and saw me. She giggled and joked about how I was actually showering during the party. I found out later her name was Claire. She said she'd wash my back, but when she did, she didn't use soap, and in the process, she crushed her solo cup in her hand, spilling beer all over my back. While she was doing this, someone called out to her, and she shouted back, "I'm showering with Kevin." I wasn't Kevin, nor did I look anything like the Kevins on the soccer team. Two guys and a girl came over, and when they saw me, they started telling her I wasn't Kevin. But she wasn't convinced. After about 2 minutes of arguing, they just started calling me New Kevin and offered me a shot. I took it with them, and the girl who thought I was Kevin grabbed my dong and asked if I could make it move. Her friends pulled her away, telling her, "For real, that's not Kevin." They eventually took her back to her dorm room. Throughout the whole thing, I barely spoke except to tell her I wasn't Kevin and to accept the shot. The guys from my floor kept calling me New Kevin for the rest of the year whenever they saw me. The girl who had grabbed me gave me dirty looks whenever we crossed paths, and Claire avoided me in embarrassment until I moved to a nicer dorm later on. Story 19. During my freshman year, I worked while going to school, so I was always juggling responsibilities. One Saturday night, I had a shift early the next morning, and wanting to sleep a little, I figured I'd shower that night to save time. I went into the showers on my floor, turned on the light, and pulled back the curtain, only to find every single guy from my floor crammed into the same shower stall. They were all fully clothed, standing there in complete silence, and each one was holding a red plastic cup filled with ping-pong balls. The sight was bizarre, and before I could even process what was happening, every single one of them screamed, turned, and sprinted out of there like their lives depended on it. They didn't say a word, they just bolted. I was left standing there, absolutely confused, with no clue about what had just gone down. To this day, I've never figured out what that was all about. Story 20. In the late 70s and early 80s, Illinois State built a brand new dormitory where each room had 2 closets, one on each side wall. However, in an effort to save money, they cut corners in construction, and the backs of the closets didn't have real walls. Instead, they were just thin sheets of pressboard, barely anything separating one dorm room from the next. As soon as the students figured out what was going on, they started cutting large holes in the pressboard, allowing them to crawl from one room to the next by opening the closet door and sneaking through the hole in the wall. This quickly became a thing, and soon enough, the entire floor had a network of secret passageways connecting every dorm room. It was like building an underground tunnel system, but within the dorm walls. The creation of this hidden passageway immediately led to a new culture of massive, unstoppable dorm parties. Whenever anyone heard a knock at the door, they could quickly dash through the closet and be 7 doors down the hall by the time the RA or campus security got inside. They'd even store all the alcohol in one room while the party happened next door. So even if the RAs knew a huge party was going on, they couldn't do anything about it. The whole thing was pure chaos, with parties going on non-stop. Some of the more rebellious students would commit all kinds of mischief around campus, then race to this dorm building, knowing that once they were inside any room, there was no way the cops could track them down. Each summer, the school tried to replace the shredded pressboard with tougher materials, but the students just brought in stronger saws, and the secret passages were rebuilt year after year. Eventually, just a few years after the dorm was built, the school gave up on trying to fix it and ended up tearing the building down altogether. Story 21. A mysterious Indian woman broke into my dorm, rearranged my cables in the closet, flipped our cups, and then fled in a panic. One night, I was asleep in my dorm with my girlfriend, and my roommate and his boyfriend were also in their own beds. I had a direct line of sight to the kitchen, as the door was slightly cracked open. I was pretty sure my sweet mate, who lived in the dorm but not in my room, had already returned, so when the door moved, I immediately woke up. I peered through the crack and saw a dark figure dart past the door. I quickly rolled out of bed, slipped out of my room, and noticed that my closet, which was in the kitchen, terrible dorm layout, was open. I could hear someone rummaging around in it. To make things even weirder, all of our glasses were upside down on the table. Confused, I cautiously walked around the kitchen, and that's when I saw a small Indian woman stretching one of my AUX cables out on the top shelf of my closet with surprising care. I asked, "Can I help you?" She quickly replied, "Oh no, sorry. I'm just heading to bed." And then, She tried to walk into my bedroom where my girlfriend, my roommate, and his boyfriend were all sleeping. At this point, I darted in front of her and asked, "What the hell are you doing here?" She just stared blankly and said she didn't know who I was. "Excuse me, I don't know who you are." Random AUX cable arranger who flipped over my cups. My girlfriend woke up when I raised my voice, and the mystery girl tried to push past me to get into my room. My girlfriend peeked out and saw this strange scene unfolding. The girl explained that she was Freela and was looking for someone named Chris. But there was no Chris in the room, so things just got weirder. Then, without warning, she froze, whispered sorry, and bolted out of the room. Edit. For those wondering if I ever found out what was going on, I told the story at a party the next night, and a girl there was like, "What? I was at the party she disappeared from. We were looking for her for hours." It turns out she was probably just crossfade. Smelled like booze but didn't seem like your average drunk. Story 22. Our dorm was set up with singles, and the doors directly faced each other across the hallway, opening into the rooms. We were on the 5th floor of the building. One day, I was playing Super Smash Bros. In my friend's room with the door open when we heard some of our floor mates laughing in the hallway. They had taken an entire roll of duct tape and created a duct tape rope connecting one of their doors to their friend's, who was in his room studying, completely unaware of the prank unfolding. They pounded on his door and let him know he was trapped in his room, and they weren't going to let him out. Dan ran to the door, yanked on it with all his might, but the duct tape held firm. After struggling for a while, he finally gave up and said he'd figure out another way to get out. About 20 minutes later, Dan knocked on his door and told his friends to go down the hall to the bathroom and look out the window. Curious, we all followed and peered out the window toward his. We watched as Dan opened his window and threw something out, lowering it toward the courtyard 40 feet below. As we got a better look, we realized it wasn't a rope. It was a 30-foot-long Ethernet cord. By the time we all processed this, Dan was already dangling out of the window, holding onto the Ethernet cord like it was a lifeline, 40 feet above the ground. Keep in mind, it was the middle of winter, and the temperature was probably around 30 degrees. As he tried to rappel down the side of the building, our RA walked into the bathroom and saw what was going on. He almost had a heart attack when he spotted Dan hanging there. Against all odds, Dan somehow made it to the bottom of the Ethernet cord, but he was still about 15 feet above the concrete. He dropped and rolled onto the ground, and we all cheered as he sprinted toward the door to get back inside. When he came back up to his room, he showed us how he pulled it off. The crazy guy had tied the Ethernet cord to his radiator next to the window, using it as an anchor to rappel down the building. It was the wildest thing I've ever seen, not just in a dorm, but anywhere. Story 23. During my sophomore year, I started dating a girl and, honestly, I was hardly ever in my dorm room since she had a single and I was stuck in a double. One day, I realized I needed to grab something off my computer, so I walked back to my room. When I opened the door, I found my roommate sitting at his computer, and on my bed was a box. As I walked to my desk, I noticed something odd in the box. I peered inside and saw, well, a small farm animal, about the size of a large cat. I couldn't quite make sense of what I was looking at, and I just froze for a second, trying to process it. My roommate, however, acted like this was just another normal day. I think I lasted all of 45 seconds trying to play it cool before I broke and asked, "What the hell is on my bed?" He casually looked over and said, "Oh, a lamb." There was another long pause before I asked, "Where did it come from?" "My farm," he replied. Like that explained everything. And that's how I found out my roommate grew up on a farm. Apparently, when sheep give birth, sometimes the runt gets ignored by the mother and doesn't get fed. So, instead of having his parents deal with it, my roommate decided it would be easier to bring the lamb back to school and take care of it himself. Since I wasn't around much, he figured the lamb could just sleep in my bed. And so it did. I didn't sleep in my room for 2 weeks because that's where the lamb had taken over. Story 24. During the first week of college, someone left a used rubber in one of the girls' showers. The RA completely lost it and sent out an email that was basically a public lecture on sexual decency, though, let's be real, by Christmas break pretty much everyone on that floor was hooking up without much care for privacy. Of course, I saved the email, because it was gold. Here's one of my favorite excerpts. I have never had to deal with something this disgusting, and the fact that one, or two, of you seem to think it's appropriate, not only to bang in a public shower, but to leave your rubber there really makes me wonder whether you all have the maturity to be living away from your parents. I would suggest none of you do such thing on my floor in a public area again. I have alerted all of the resident advisors in this building that if they ever come across this kind of lewd, irresponsible behavior on my floor, they are to wake me up, no matter what time of night. and I will make sure that your write-up is as embarrassing and painful as possible. Turns out, it wasn't a used rubber at all. A girl on my floor had actually filled it with conditioner as a prank. She's now my best friend. Story 25. There was a guy down the hall from me who had a meat dehydrator and would make his own beef jerky. Every time he made a new batch, he'd go around offering pieces to everyone on the floor, and honestly, they were amazing. So good, in fact, that one day, he barged into his suite mate's room after walking through the bathroom, since our dorms were set up as two-room suites connected by a shared bathroom, and found his suite mate going to town with a sorority girl. Instead of backing out awkwardly like anyone else would, the guy just stood there, seemingly unfazed. He even tried to make a quick escape, but before he could leave, his suite mate stopped what he was doing, looked at him, and said, "Actually, I'll have a piece of that." The guy casually pulled out of the sorority girl to walk over and grab some jerky, totally unbothered by the situation. As he did, he heard the girl scoff behind him, and without missing a beat, he turned to her and deadpanned, "Oh, I'm sorry, did you want some too?" It was one of the most bizarre yet hilarious moments in our dorm, and to be honest, I think the jerky was just as big a hit as the whole situation. Story 26. A couple of hippie friends moved in together, and from day one, they set their sights on creating the ultimate party room. They started by stacking their beds into bunk beds and moved their desks and chairs into the study room. Then, they covered the entire floor with blankets, lots of blankets. We're talking layers and layers, thick enough to feel like a giant mattress. This room quickly became a hub for daily drum circles, with people coming in to get high without fail. One day, a friend of one of them puked in the corner, and neither of them wanted to take responsibility for it. So what did they do? They just threw more blankets on top, like it never happened. There were a few fights too. One of them even pissed on the other side of the room where his stuff was. The other retaliated. And of course, they just covered it up with more blankets. As time passed, the room became a bizarre mixture of blankets, pizza boxes, spilled bong water, and, well, bodily fluids. They literally made a kind of lasagna out of it all. Blankets, pizza boxes, and everything else stacked in layers. By the time spring rolled around, the whole dorm had a distinct, unpleasant smell. But the guys were so used to it, they didn't even notice. When it came time for move-out, though, the real nightmare began. As they started cleaning up, the rot smell hit them full force. It had been brewing under all the layers, and they had to use box cutters to break it all apart, taking it out in chunks. It was a disgusting, chaotic mess, something that would haunt the halls of the dorm for years to come. Story 27. I attended Columbia University and lived in John Jay dorm during my freshman year. The building was 15 stories tall, if I remember correctly. The key things to know are, 1. It's located on 114th Street, about 120 blocks north of Lower Manhattan, and 2. Back in the early 2000s, there was nothing stopping people from climbing out onto the roof from the top floor, which now seems a little crazy considering it was the 2000s. So, a week into my freshman year, 9/11 happened. After watching the news for a while on the TV on my floor, I decided to go up to the top floor. I had met a guy there during orientation, and he let me use his room to climb out onto the roof. From up there, you could see the towers burning, even from that far uptown. I had my camera with me and took a picture. Moments after I clicked the shutter, the first tower collapsed. I could hear people screaming from all over the building. It was surreal. That's my dorm story, climbing onto the roof and witnessing the collapse of the World Trade Center firsthand. Oh, and we also busted in on a guy banging his RA once, but that's another story for another time. Story 28. I caught a girl trying to steal my peephole once. One time, during a snowstorm, a girl in my dorm lost a bet and had to run a lap around the outside of the building in a bikini. It had already snowed about 4 to 5 inches, and it was still coming down hard. Another time, I was in my dorm while my roommate was away for the weekend. It was around 4:30 or 5 a.m., I was still awake, and I heard this scratching and squeaking sound on my door. I got up, opened it, and found a girl standing there, leaning against the door frame. I asked, can I help you? She just smiled at me, then ran down the hall. I was too tired to think much of it, so I shrugged and went back to bed. The next day, I found out that all the peepholes on my floor had been stolen, except for mine. Turns out, they were really easy to unscrew from the outside. Story 29. So, my first day at ASU, I went around meeting everyone on my floor. I already had a group of friends who lived off campus at an apartment complex, and they were throwing a party for me since I was younger and had just made it to college. I decided to invite everyone on my floor because they barely knew anyone, and I thought it would be a great way to introduce myself. Everyone came, had a good time, and as the night wore on, people started to head out. One girl from my dorm, let's call her Kate, told her friend she was staying behind because, well, it was an apartment full of guys, so someone was probably getting laid. Her friend left, Kate stayed, and by 2 a.m., most people were passed out. My buddy, who seemed like he was going to hook up with Kate, was in his room and I was crashing on the couch. At this point, Kate was pretty drunk. She went to the bathroom, and after a while, I started to get curious. I was the only one still awake when I suddenly smelled this overwhelming combination of fart and something else, just terrible. I wasn't about to ruin things with this smell, so I ignored it. Then, Kate opened the bathroom door just enough to stick her head out. She asked if we had any extra pants. I was confused for a second, but then she clarified, saying she meant pajama pants. I thought, oh, okay, and grabbed her some. She took the pants and went into my buddy's room. And that was that, or so I thought. Fast forward to 9 a.m., I wake up, everything is quiet, and I decide to bike home. Kate had apparently left earlier, and no one heard her. Around noon, I get a call from my buddy, and in the most serious tone he could muster, he says, "Tommy, did you crap all over our bathroom?" I was like, no. And if I did, I would have at least cleaned it up. He tells me to come back immediately. I get back to the apartment, and when he shows me the bathroom, it's a disaster. There's crap everywhere. On the side of the toilet, the floor, the shower mat, the sink, the counter, even the mirror. It was insane. Then I remembered Kate had asked for pants the night before when it smelled like something had gone horribly wrong. A few nights later, during a poker game, our friend Marcus said he was going to CSI the bathroom crime scene, and he broke down the situation like a true detective. Here's his analysis. Kate, totally wasted, needed to go to the bathroom. She somehow managed to sit on the toilet with her pants still on and ended up crapping in her pants. Realizing she still had them on, she tried to take them off while still sitting on the toilet, and it ended up on the side of the toilet and the mat. Then, she tried cleaning it up, but since she was blacked out, she made it worse. She grabbed her pants and tried to wash them in the sink, getting it all over the counter, cabinets, and sink. At this point, she gave up, opened the door, and asked for pants for me, no doubt smelling the mess. After that, she went to bed, and my buddy claimed nothing happened. Sure, the next morning, Kate was too embarrassed to clean anything up, so she just bailed and ran out. Things were definitely awkward in the dorm after that. I'm pretty sure she told everyone some crazy story to cover herself because she knew I knew what really happened. I never told anyone the full truth, except for a few close friends, because it would have been messed up. But that's when I realized people crap themselves a lot in college. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.